Your uncle asks the same question almost every time he sees you, phrased slightly differently depending on his mood. Sometimes it's, "So when are you getting a real job?" Sometimes it's softer, "Any luck finding something stable?" Once, at a wedding, in front of 6 other relatives, it was, "We just worry you're wasting your degree." You're 34, you have $7.1 million. You told him, like you always do, that you're still figuring things out. It started with a self-storage facility nobody in your family had ever heard of you buying, because you never told them you bought it. You were 26, 3 years out of college, working a job in logistics that your uncle approved of, specifically because it had the word manager in the title, even though the actual work bored you in a way that felt almost physical, a low hum of wasted hours you couldn't shake. You'd been reading about self-storage facilities the way some people read about sports, obsessively in the evenings, drawn to the unglamorous math of it. Small footprint, low maintenance, recession-resistant demand. Because people downsizing, divorcing, moving, or dying all generate storage need regardless of what the economy is doing. You found a rundown facility 2 hours outside the city, 40 units, half of them empty, owned by a man in his 70s who'd stopped actively managing it years earlier and just let it decay slowly while collecting whatever rent still trickled in. You offered $290,000, financed through an SBA loan, and a chunk of savings you'd built specifically for this without telling a single person in your family, because you already knew what the reaction would be before you'd even said a word. Not because they'd be unsupportive exactly, but because self-storage facility would sound to your uncle like exactly the kind of unstable, undefined thing he already suspected you were doing with your life instead of getting a real job. You quit your logistics job 4 months after closing, not recklessly, but because the facility's occupancy had already climbed from 50% to 70%, and the math on your time made more sense there than at a desk answering emails about freight schedules. You told your family you were doing some consulting work, a phrase vague enough to end most conversations before they started, and specific enough to sound like something with a LinkedIn profile behind it. Those first few months of actually running the place were harder than the spreadsheets had prepared you for. You drove out 3 times a week to fix a broken gate motor, negotiate with a contractor over a resurfacing job that had gone over budget, and personally track down 2 tenants who'd stopped paying and needed the lien process explained to them in person because they didn't answer calls. You did all of this on weekends and evenings at first, still technically employed, running on almost no sleep for the better part of a year, telling your parents you were just tired from work, which was true in a way they had no way of understanding correctly. Year 1, after the loan payment, the facility netted $31,000. Not the kind of number that changes a life, but the kind that proves an idea. Your uncle asked that year, at a barbecue, what exactly your consulting work involved. You gave him a 2-sentence answer about logistics advisory work, which was technically not a lie, since you had, once, advised yourself on logistics. He nodded slowly, unconvinced, and mentioned that his coworker's son had just gotten a position at an insurance company with full benefits, said in the tone people use when they're offering you a lesson disguised as small talk. By year 3, you'd bought a second facility, smaller, 60 miles from the first, purchased at a discount because the previous owner was going through a messy divorce and needed to liquidate quickly. Combined, the 2 facilities were netting around $94,000 a year. You'd also started quietly investing the surplus into a mix of REITs and index funds, the same conservative, unglamorous instinct that seems to run through everyone who's actually built something lasting instead of chasing something loud. The uncle question kept coming, almost ritualistically at every gathering. Eid, weddings, random Sunday dinners you'd get roped into. So, real job yet? Sometimes it came with a specific comparison. A cousin who'd just made partner somewhere. A nephew who'd landed a government position with a pension attached. You absorbed each comparison the way you'd absorbed the last one, quietly, without correction, because correcting it would mean explaining self-storage facilities to a man who measured stability exclusively through titles and W-2s. By year 6, you'd added a 3rd facility and, more importantly, hired a regional manager to oversee daily operations across all 3, which meant the entire operation, netting close to $240,000 a year by that point, required maybe 4 hours of your actual attention a week. You spent those newly freed hours doing something you'd wanted to do for years, learning to build small automated tools for managing occupancy and rate optimization across storage facilities, which turned, almost by accident, into a small side business licensing that software to other independent storage operators who couldn't afford the enterprise platforms the big REITs used. That software business, started as a curiosity, was generating another $110,000 a year in licensing fees by year 9, on top of the facilities. Your accountant, a careful man named Devraj who's handled increasingly complicated returns for you since year 2, told you flatly during your year 9 review that your total net worth, facilities, software business, and the accumulated investment portfolio combined had crossed $7 million. You didn't tell your uncle. You didn't tell anyone, actually, except your accountant, whose job it literally is to know. You went to a family dinner 2 weeks later, and when your uncle asked, in his usual tone, whether you'd thought about getting something more permanent going, you told him you were still figuring things out. The same sentence you've been saying for 8 years, worn smooth from repetition like a stone in a river. There's a specific reason you never correct him, and it isn't pride, and it isn't spite. Your uncle grew up in a system where stability meant one thing: a title, a pension, a predictable ladder you climbed slowly and safely for 40 years. He came to this country with almost nothing, worked at a factory for over 2 decades, and built his entire sense of security around the idea that unpredictability is the enemy, that anything without a fixed salary and a fixed title is one bad month away from collapse. His worry about you isn't judgment exactly. It's a translation error, an old operating system trying to parse a kind of life it was never built to recognize. Correcting him wouldn't just require explaining self-storage facilities. It would require dismantling an entire worldview he's spent 40 years relying on to feel safe in an unfamiliar country. Your cousin Zane, who did take the traditional path, an accounting job at a mid-sized firm downtown, mentioned at a recent dinner that he'd just gotten a small promotion, more title than money, and the table lit up with congratulations in a way that made something in you go quiet for a second, not out of envy but out of recognition. That's what your uncle is actually looking for from you, not a number. A moment like that one, a title he can repeat proudly to his friends, a sentence that fits neatly into a story he already understands. Your cousin Zane, who did take the traditional path, an accounting job at a mid-sized firm downtown, mentioned at a recent dinner that he'd just gotten a small promotion, more title than money, and the table lit up with congratulations in a way that made something in you go quiet for a second, not out of envy, but out of recognition. That's what your uncle is actually looking for from you. Not a number. A moment like that one. A title he can repeat proudly to his friends. A sentence that fits neatly into a story he already understands. Later that same night, Zane pulled you aside near the drink cooler, half joking, and asked if your consulting thing was ever going to turn into something with actual benefits, health insurance, a 401k match, the things he'd been told mattered his entire life. You told him you had a decent retirement account, which was true, understated to the point of being almost funny given the actual number sitting in it. He nodded, satisfied with that answer in a way he wouldn't have been satisfied with the real one, because a decent retirement account fit inside his framework, and $7 million from self-storage facilities did not. You could give him a version of that story. You could say the words, "I own 3 self-storage facilities and a small software company," and watch his face try to process it. You've imagined that moment more than once, mostly late at night, wondering whether it would land as pride or as one more thing he doesn't fully understand, and therefore doesn't fully trust. Because stability to him was never really about the money underneath it. It was about legibility, about being able to explain to his friends in one clean sentence that his nephew turned out fine. Devraj sent your Year 11 summary on a Tuesday, the number sitting at $7.1 million after a strong year for both the facilities and the software licensing. You read it in your car outside the 3rd storage facility, engine off, the same way you've read most of these updates over the years, alone, in a parking lot, with nobody around to react to it with you. That weekend, at another family dinner, your uncle asked again, gentler this time, almost tired of asking, whether you'd thought more about your future. You looked at him for a second longer than usual. You thought about the barbecue 8 years ago, the insurance company comparison, all the small comparisons since. You told him you had, actually, thought about it a lot, and that you were happy with where things had ended up. He nodded slowly, the way he always does, still not fully believing you, still filing you somewhere in his mind under figuring it out, a category he's clearly hoped you'd graduate out of for almost a decade now. You didn't correct the record. You passed him the rice instead and let the conversation move on to something else, the way it always does, your $7.1 million sitting quietly underneath a sentence he's heard so many times by now it's practically become part of the furniture at every family dinner you've ever had together. Driving home that night, you thought about the factory floor your uncle worked on for 23 years. The same shift, the same machine, the same predictable paycheck that let him sleep at night in a country that had taken him decades to feel safe in. You understood, maybe more clearly than you ever had before, that his question was never really about you. It was about a version of safety he'd fought hard to build for himself, one he was terrified you were walking away from without a net underneath you. What he doesn't know is that the net is there. It's just built out of storage units and licensing fees instead of a title and a pension, and it's larger than anything a factory floor could have ever produced in a single lifetime. Maybe someday you'll show him the actual number, sit him down the way you sometimes imagine, and watch his face do whatever it does when the story he's been telling himself for a decade finally meets the real one. Or maybe you'll keep passing him the rice for another 10 years, letting him worry in the specific, familiar way he's always worried. Because some kinds of peace aren't worth disturbing just to be understood correctly.